Christian nationalists in the United States who are almost always also Christian Zionists, but they also have many more views than Christian Zionism per se. And they believe that America should be run by Christians. And if Christians are going to do that, they have to take on the Seven Mountain Mandate, which is to say the Christian control of American life through seven different parts of the country.
Hello and welcome to Protean View. I'm Riyadh, as always, here with my co-host Mohammed Bushra. And we're joined for this episode by Melani McAlister. She's a professor of American Studies and International Relations at the George Washington University and a scholar of the cultural, religious, and political history of the United States with a focus on how U.S. interests shape the Middle East and Africa. She's the author of The Kingdom of God Has No Borders, A Global History of American Evangelicals, and Epic Encounters, Culture, Media, and U.S. Interests in the Middle East. Her new book is titled Promises Then the Storm, Notes on Memory, Protest, and the Israel-Gaza War. We invited her onto the show to discuss the current trajectory and place of the Christian right in the United States, including why the right-wing movement is now splitting on the question of Israel and what that suggests about the future of the U.S. Israel relationship. We also talk about the history of the Christian right, Islam, and the evangelical discourse on persecuted Christians, and much more. In a moment, you'll hear that discussion, but first, a quick thank you to our supporters on Substack and Patreon, without whom this episode would not be possible. If you like what we do here at Protean View, please do consider joining our community on Substack at muftah.org and Patreon at patreon.com/ProteanView, which you can do for as low as $5 a month. To help us keep this show running, please do follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and wherever else you find your podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at muftah.org to stay updated on the latest from us. Thanks for listening and for your support. And here now is our conversation with Melani McAlister. So, Melani, we usually start off with we tend to or like to start off our interviews with big picture questions. So let's start with this. Why is Israel so important to the Christian right or to certain segments of the Christian right? Perhaps you can also talk about Christian Zionism and how is it different from, say, Christian nationalism and evangelicalism?
Great. Well, first, thanks for having me. It's really great to be talking to you. And the question you just asked, I could probably answer for an hour, but I'll try to keep it straightforward. In general, I would say that for American evangelicals, so by that I'm going to mean Protestant Christians with a conservative theology, that Israel is important for two reasons. One, well, it's probably more than two, but two for sure. One is theological. That is to say, most evangelicals would interpret the Bible as saying that the Jewish people in general, and Israel in particular, are loved by God. And if you are not on the side of Israel, again, in the Bible, the word Israel is often used to refer to the Jewish people. There was no state. Then you're not pleasing to God. So there's a theological interpretation that people then use to refer both to the Jewish people, but more often to Israel, the state, these days. The second reason is more sociological, I guess, in the sense that Israel has worked very hard, especially since 1967, to make itself into a very inviting place for American Christians and other Christians around the world to come as tourists. And American Christians go there in vast numbers, Catholics, Mormons, Protestant evangelicals of both Protestant evangelicals and Protestants who are not evangelicals. Going to the Holy Land is a massive tourist industry that Israel has very carefully constructed to tell a narrative about Israel's love for Christianity, love for Christians, and closeness to America. And we could talk more about that if you'd like. But those two things work together to create a very strong sense of affiliation with Israel that is on a spectrum for sure among American evangelicals. There are groups of evangelicals who hold that much more strongly and those who hold it much more loosely. But I would say it's so effective in part because it is a common view to feel close or affiliated with Israel, even among people who are not very theologically invested or theologically sophisticated, or even that religious, but who affiliate in some way with Christianity. So I know about this. In part, I grew up knowing about Israel as a young Southern Baptist in North Carolina back in a long time ago, growing up in the 70s. And I went to a Baptist church, a Southern Baptist church, which would be defined as evangelical. All Southern Baptist churches would essentially be evangelical churches. And I had a lot of experience just in terms of the regular preaching and that kind of thing. But I also was very involved in youth group and youth activities as a young Baptist. And that was where I learned a lot more about the kind of attraction and affiliation with Israel. And the first time I became aware of it, I was at a summer youth camp in North Carolina when on the last day they had like a parade of flags of all the nations of the world. And then at the end of the parade, there were two flags at the top. And the one was the U.S. flag and the other one was a flag I didn't recognize. And so when I asked my counselor, well, what flag is that? She was like, oh, that's the flag of Israel. I mean, it had just that tone with like, in a way she would do, that's the U.S. flag and that's the flag of Israel. And so I was like, okay, this is important. And then there are other different ways, in my own experience and in other people's experience, that the kind of popular culture or ordinary culture of daily life encourages that sense of affiliation.
When did that attitude about Israel historically emerge, and specifically this idea that the Israel mentioned in the Bible is continuous with the state of Israel? I mean, Israel as a state is less than a century old.
Yeah, the Zionism of evangelical Christians, including some in Europe, really emerged with the Zionist movement. So there is a strong sense that the end of times, which many evangelicals believe is an important part of God's prophecy for the future, can only occur. Jesus can only return to earth after Israel has been reestablished as a state. And they believe that through a very particular and complicated interpretation of certain books of the Bible, Daniel, Ezekiel, Revelations, and others, that they've kind of put together into a story that was first promoted by John Darby in the 19th century and became instantiated in the Scofield Reference Bible in 1911, which was part of the growth of what was then called the fundamentalist movement in opposition to more liberal Christianity. So it's been around even before the state of Israel itself. But after the founding of the state, there was a kind of, run on prophecy, and people were talking about it a great deal, like, okay, this is it. The end times is obviously coming. And that was at the same time, coincidentally, but very significantly, that American evangelicals, or what we now call evangelicals, were splitting into fundamentalist and evangelical camps. So that became much more intense after 1947, when Israel is established and people began to, through the partition, and people began to begin prophecy watching with a kind of intensity. And this is happening just as American evangelicals, who would have still been called mostly fundamentalist in the 1940s, are emerging out of the kind of stupor they had been in the early part of the 20th century and are becoming more self-confident, more political, more organized. The National Association of Evangelicals is founded in this period in the 1940s. The rise of a whole bunch of Bible schools, a whole bunch of stuff begins to happen in the 1940s that makes evangelicals more self-confident, more prominent, more organized, and trying to become more mainstream. And so as that happens, there are all sorts of things, minutiae that happens among evangelicals about those who are more prophecy-oriented, those who are less prophecy-oriented, all of that kind of thing. But the fact is that the modern evangelical movement, as people might understand it now, emerged in tandem with the state of Israel. And that meant that it was shockingly important. Even as it didn't really take off, the love of Israel, the enthusiasm for Israel didn't super take off until 1967. And part of that is that Israel itself changed, not just through the 1967 war, but there were a lot of tensions between American evangelicals and Israel because of Israel's essential ban on proselytizing. And American evangelicals, if they like anything, they like proselytizing. And so there was a lot of tension. You can see it in the pages of Christianity Today and elsewhere, like, why are they not letting us proselytize? We've got to save the Jews, that kind of thing. So ultimately, Israel figures out that they're much less worried about proselytizing than they are about having Americans on their side in terms of foreign policy. And so a lot of that backs off.
So as a follow-up, I'd like to ask a question regarding this difference that, you noted the kind of rise of evangelicals, initially termed fundamentalists. What, for the uninitiated listener, how might you explain the difference between evangelical Christians, or evangelical Protestants specifically, and mainline Protestants? Is the difference primarily theological? Is there something else going on? And is there a big split between these two camps over the question of Zionism?
Great question. Yes, there are significant differences between mainline or liberal Protestantism, ecumenical Protestantism, and evangelicals. And those differences are theological. They are related also to how people think about church, ecclesiastical, and they're also related to kind of sociological differences. In the 1930s, you could have said that evangelicals, who are more theologically conservative, who tend to say that they believe the Bible is literally true, who also believe that you cannot go to heaven except if you accept Jesus as your personal Savior, who tend to have theologically conservative views, many views of which are shared, by the way, by African-American Christians in all sorts of denominations, but are very distinct among white churchgoers to mostly evangelical denominations. That view in the 1930s among Protestants was more held by people who were less educated, more located in the South, more working class than those who were mainline Protestants. In fact, the term mainline Protestant comes from the Philadelphia Main Line, this fancy suburb of Philadelphia where a lot of fancy Protestants lived. And so mainline or liberal Protestantism would have shared many of those theological beliefs in softer forms, but over time in the 40s, 50s, 60s, became much less likely to argue that you must have a personal relationship with Jesus to be saved. Many, in fact, believe in universal salvation. Everyone is saved ultimately by Jesus' sacrifice. They tend to have a non-literal reading of the Bible, to believe that the Bible is a historical document produced by human beings and we can interpret it in historical context. So we don't have to say when God says don't eat shrimp, that you don't eat shrimp because that was a specific time and place. And then the other kind of sociological difference is that up until maybe the 70s, and maybe even up until today, liberal Protestants tend to be a little bit higher in economic class and a little bit more educated, although that's certainly dramatically less true than it would have been 70 years ago. Did you ask me another question?
Whether they differ as well over the question of Israel and Zionism.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Great question. So the answer is yes, but that again has changed over time. So that when Israel was founded, I think it's fair to say that most liberal Protestant churches were quite enthusiastic about its founding. Even those who had been working with people in Palestine for years, who may have had churches there, who've been, there's obviously a number of Christians in Palestine who had connections sometimes with American Christians, but people were fairly enthusiastic about it. But however, fairly quickly, the so-called Palestinian refugee problem becomes something that liberal Christians, especially American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker, the sort of arm of the Quakers, some of the Presbyterians, some of the others, had missionaries there, had people on the ground, and were very concerned about what was happening to the Palestinians. They did not have, I would not say, a very strong political, some did, but mostly as the church members wouldn't have a big political push around a Palestinian state until much later, but in the 40s and 50s would have said that, this is not fair how people are being treated. The Palestinian refugees are an issue. They need to be treated differently, and would have been much more critical of Israel for that. by the period after 1967, into the 70s, there's a huge divide. As the liberal churches become more liberal, they explicitly take up issues of anti-racism as a major issue for themselves. Which leads them to anti-colonialism, which leads them to think about Palestine. So the churches really divide after 67.
I wanted to ask why you think the Christian right is splitting on the question of Israel now. Obviously, what's happening in Gaza is an important factor here, but also news about Gaza is mostly, I wouldn't say gone, but it's not front and center as it was in 2025. Yet the debate in America about Israel rages on. We seem to be at a turning point. What can you tell us about that?
It's a great question and complicated because I think one is that the Christian right is, the American evangelical movement is not all the Christian right. So let me just step back one second and say, when I talk about evangelicals, I tend to use a pretty loose theological definition, but a definition that says people believe in, the second coming of Jesus. You have to be a Christian to be saved, a number of other things, including a fairly literal sense of the Bible. And so by that definition, there are many African-American churches who believe that and who share a lot of theological beliefs with evangelicals and actually share some organizations and podiums and other kinds of things. So there are many people who might not call themselves evangelical in the African-American church who are quite overlapping in a lot of ways, except around Zionism, with the white evangelical church. And the white evangelical church, aside from that, is not white. It's a multiracial church. It's become much more multiracial. There are a great many very active Asian Americans among the evangelical community. The Korean church especially, a lot of Koreans in the United States who are evangelicals, and that has been significant. Also Africans, literal African immigrants. There are, of course, evangelicals who are Arab, who are European, who have all sorts of different backgrounds. But it's a mistake to think American evangelical and think only of the kind of typical image of Jerry Falwell or Charlie Kirk or something. And that's important because it has had an impact on how evangelicals think, including impact on how they think about Israel. But the other thing I would say is that because that is true, I take this fairly broad definition of evangelicals, then that includes a great many people who also are not on the right, who might be moderately conservative. Even there's an actual small but valiant left-wing evangelical movement. A lot of people who fall somewhere in the middle, who have some views that are fairly liberal and some views that are fairly conservative. So when we think about Christian right, I think it's important to recognize that there are people who are quite active as Christian right, people who are passive supporters, and people who are evangelical but not on the right. They are a minority, but they are real. So when we think about then the Christian right specifically, then we think about also the right, which uses a lot of Christian rhetoric and call a lot of people on the right who like to think of themselves or talk about themselves as evangelical, who have no particular involvement in an evangelical church or any evangelical organization, right? That's just their identity. And so that's fine. I'm not telling people what they are or aren't. But if you think about the different kinds of evangelicals we have, then there are people who go to a big mega church. They may, be involved in evangelical organizations. That's one kind. And then we have other people who identify as Christian right who do so for more political reasons. Somebody like Charlie Kirk, for example, who we can come back to, was pretty Christian identified, but most of his politics wasn't Christian identified until about 2019, 2020. So the Christian right in the United States has fractured over Israel, I think, and hasn't quite fractured, has tensions. There's some fractures, but overall is more tensions, I would say, about Israel for a couple of different reasons. One is that, as Marjorie Taylor Greene and a couple of other people say, I can't unsee children dying. And that reality, of course, there are all sorts of children dying in the world all the time, but that was something that was on the news that people would have access to. We're hearing other people talk about. And I think we can take it as a kind of authentic, we did not like what we saw. Add to that, we also don't like being lied to. And so a lot of that happened under the Biden administration. So that adds to the ability to, get revved up about it. But literally, the Biden administration was asking people not to see what they saw and was continuing to throw money at Israel. And again, spending money on foreign countries is a no-no among MAGA people. And it's also something that many conservative Christians have questions about it. They've always liked Israel. It's always been the exception. So that's, an important change. But I think we can assume that those were real kind of heartfelt opinions that people came to for legitimate reasons. I think there is also a very real strain of anti-Semitism in the evangelical church that has had to be tamped down over time. It has sometimes been quite overt. In the 1980s, there was a minister, it wasn't Jerry Falwell, it was another one, but there was a minister who was talking about salvation. And he basically said, look, you guys may think that Israel is great, but I'm just telling you, God does not hear the prayers of a Jew. And then the Israelis invited him to Israel and gave him a tour, and he came back. I was Bailey Smith. He was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. And, he came back loving Israel, loving Jews, etc. But I think there's no small amount of a kind of under the surface anti-Semitism among the right in the United States, not specifically among the Christian right, but that is there too. And so when people say, like, we don't like to support foreign wars, I believe it. When they say we don't like to send money to Israel as a policy issue, I believe it. But I also think there's a certain amount of people who was like, you know what? Yay, we finally get to say we don't really like Israel because, we don't really, they're being supported because American Jews in this country aren't really good Americans, and they are supporting Israel instead of America. And we always knew that, and now we're going to kind of say it. And so you can see that. That's why Tucker Carlson is in trouble these days, because he has, platformed that kind of thing and won't back off of it. And there's a number of people who, give it 3 minutes. Then in 2017, when the Unite the Right rally was in Charlottesville, Virginia, and people were, there wasn't specifically Christian, but there were Christian identified people there for sure. They were chanting, "The Jews will not replace us." So, we have to take that seriously too.
You said you don't think the right is necessarily splitting on the question of Israel. It's more fracturing on the question of Israel. Could you just briefly clarify what you meant by that?
Well, I was thinking about how, obviously Tucker Carlson is one thing, but I was thinking about Charlie Kirk, actually, because before he died, a lot of people were saying, look, Charlie Kirk is having some questions about Israel. And he wrote a letter to Benjamin Netanyahu saying, look, you've got a problem here. I get all these questions about what's going on with Israel, and people in my constituency, including young conservatives, think that Israel might be committing a genocide and think that we shouldn't be supporting Israel. We should just be supporting Americans. And he sort of listed all these things, which he then proceeded to say, we're going to need to help you. I'm willing to help you, set up a strategy to counter all that. So I don't think Charlie Kirk was really developing his own questions about whether he should support Israel. I think he was trying to sell a job, sell himself as holding a particular role with the government. But he was recognizing that young people were coming to his events and having real concerns, young conservatives coming to his events and having real concerns. And he had to take that seriously. So I think he himself was not peeling off. But I think he was trying to figure out how he could get the Israelis to do a better job of selling their position so that he would not have this kind of set of doubts among the young people who were coming to see him. But I have not seen what I would call a significant fracture. I don't see, I would be thrilled to see such a fracture, but I just don't feel like there's that many people who are actually saying anything other than, maybe Israel should be a little more careful.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's this broad sentiment now that, especially among young people, that Israel is doomed in the future politically in this country, that among both the left and the right, Israel is historically unpopular. But it's hard not to notice that a lot of criticism of Israel and of Zionism among the right is qualitatively very different than criticism of Israel on the left. The right has historically failed to separate Zionism from Judaism. And those on the right who are now critical of Israel and critical of Zionism are often expressing that criticism in anti-Semitic terms. So, some of these people once believed anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism. And in reversing that position and believing that, now Zionism is this danger that needs to be addressed, they're almost unequipped to thinking about it in the language and the register and even the historical context the left has been discussing this issue in. There's a question there. I'm struggling to articulate it. Maybe you could just comment on.
Yeah. I actually have a comment. I don't know if it's what you were trying to ask, but I would say that one of the reasons that the left has been good at separating Zionism from Judaism is the importance of Jews on the American left. And so, the American left, I once had a professor when I was in grad school who's like a German-American guy, no Jewish history, was learning Yiddish because he said it was the only language the American left ever had. And so the significance of American Jews, including from early days on the criticisms of Israel after 1967, from American Jews. I've actually been doing some research on this lately, and it's really impressive to see Jewish women in 1972 writing letters criticizing Zionism, making a distinction between Judaism and Zionism, and calling for Palestinian state and saying, the rest of you people need to get on board with this and understand that you can, you're not anti-Semitic if you think Palestinians have rights, that kind of thing. And that was, 1972, it was really early and really clearly American Jewish women who were taking a major leading role. So you had to, if you were on the American left, you had to have some awareness, or you damn well better have some awareness of Jewish history and Jewish importance, and not be going around spouting anti-Semitic stuff. I'm not saying nobody on the left ever did that. Of course they did, but that is a reality. Up until very recently, there were not that many Jews on the right. Now we got way a lot of them, but that was, these millionaire guys who were suddenly turning into right-wing funders and pundits and, going off and funding Charlie Kirk and funding all the stuff a lot of the evangelical organizations are doing, get actual funding from, the evangelical organizations who are pro-Israel get a lot of funding from Jewish organizations. And that is new. And that is new because the rise of right-wing politics in the American Jewish community is pretty new. Not to say there was never anybody, but this kind of large-scale turn to the right among American Jews probably started, I know it did start in the late 1970s, but it has intensified tremendously in the last 20 years.
Right. The Trump administration has claimed anti-Semitism is a crisis, and it's taken it upon itself to address it as a special case of discrimination. But it's mostly been a pretext for the suppression of speech among the left, whereas right-wing anti-Semitism is completely tolerated. At the same time, we also see interesting affinities kind of coming out into the open between outright Nazis and Zionists, where you can see people with swastika tattoos, carrying the Israel flag at pro-Israel protests, organizations like, the English Defence League, the EDL in England, again, being very overtly pro-Zionist in their quest to be Islamophobic. So what's going on here? Is it that left-wing criticism of Israel is somehow threatening something which right-wing criticism doesn't? Left is, especially in this sense, quite disempowered at the moment. It's not particularly strong. It doesn't have much institutional power. So how can we kind of understand like these dynamics? The focus on left-wing anti-Zionist activism, but at the same time these
toleration.
other dynamics and toleration that's happening on, actual anti-Semitism happening on the right?
Well, I'll tell you what I want to be true. What I want to be true is that left-wing criticism of Israel has intellectual and moral respectability, and right-wing criticism does not. Therefore, the reason to attack the left is they're the only people who might actually bring other people along with them on this criticism, and the right is a bunch of loonies in some 4chan chat group. But I know it's not exactly true. So I will say that I think that it is nonetheless the case. I think it's true that the attack on the left and the attack on left-wing critics of Israel is in part because of I won't say the authenticity, but the intellectual heft that people bring to that criticism and that understanding. So when you see people who are talking about the problems with Zionism, those are people who actually know a lot about the history of Zionism, who have thought about the issues of nationalism in general, and especially ethnic nationalism, and where and why they think Israel, went down that path in a way that was problematic. They have, a deep sense of, again, not every single person, but in general, I would say a deep sense of the importance of separating anti-Semitism from criticism of Israel. And I think in that way, it does make it a bigger threat to the pro-Israel polity in the United States, because I would say that we're not talking about people who are interested in stopping anti-Semitism. We're talking about people who are interested in harshly punishing criticism of Israel. And I don't even know that they're disingenuous. Maybe these are people who actually believe that criticism of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic. They're wrong, but they might actually believe that. But they are clearly more worried about whatever it is that comes out as criticism of Israel than the things that come out as Jews will not replace us on a chant, which should have had everybody in terror. And instead, that happens and not that much else happens. And then some students say from the river to the sea, and suddenly the world is coming to an end. And so I feel like the fact is, and I really do not say this is all the people on the left or all the people who are chanting, because, there's a wide range of people who show up in every situation. But there has been such a long and deep and thoughtful conversation on the left and in liberal left circles as well about what Israel is doing. And often that conversation, up until recent years, because I've been in that conversation for a number of decades, and up until recent years, one of the problems with that conversation on the left was that there weren't enough Palestinians in it. And there was still a kind of capacity of people to say the problem is that Israel's not being true to itself, and we want Israel to be great, and it's really fundamentally great, but it's not doing the right thing. And so often it was a critique of really Israel post 67, even if sometimes that critique went further than that. So I think that the kind of transformation that we've seen, and it's actually terrifying in the last 3 to 4 years, and it, culminated in the protests against the genocide, is that the criticisms of Israel, which have been cultivated and building well before that, right, where the BDS movement was strong in the United States. BDS was a nonviolent civil resistance movement to try to put pressure on Israel, and all the people who had been running around saying, why doesn't Israel have a Mahatma Gandhi? And why does Israel have a Martin Luther King? Why doesn't Palestine have a Mahatma Gandhi? Why doesn't Palestine have a Martin Luther King? And then suddenly there's a movement that is a nonviolent global mass movement, and people are like, this is terrible, this is evil, this is hurting Israelis, and so I just see it as honestly, I see it as disingenuous. I see it as a way of people whose politics are strongly pro-Israel no matter what, or pro-Israel. They'd like to see it maybe not so Netanyahu-ish, but they're going to stand beside it over somebody else in a clinch. Those people have managed to, with a level of success that really has been shocking to me, to have managed to push back on what has been a profound sea change in opinion. And there is a sea change in opinion, but their ability to crush the expression of that opinion in public life has been one of the larger political defeats I've seen in my lifetime. And I've seen both Reagan and Trump elected. So
I want to pivot a little bit and talk about the discourse on persecuted Christians, which you've talked about in some of your articles and some of your books. There's a long history to that discourse, and in some cases, in many cases, it's been used to justify wars and military adventures. So first, can you tell us a little bit about that discourse and the history of that discourse and its significance? And then second, can you talk about it in the context of the genocide in Gaza? Because we're now seeing it come up in an interesting way, where figures like Tucker Carlson, for example, will frame their opposition to Israel's actions in terms of saving Christians and protecting Christian holy sites. And I'm kind of curious to hear what you think is going on here. Is it just that a figure like Carlson is speaking in a language that's familiar to his audience, or is there more to it? How do we make sense of it?
Yeah, in fact, in my book, The Kingdom of God Has No Borders, the focus on persecuted Christians is one of the two major threads through the book, because it has been one of the political organizing frameworks, especially for people who have a more global vision of evangelical Christianity. And it comes back home even for people with a more domestic focus. But persecuted Christians is a motif in Christianity since at least Paul, maybe not Jesus, but at least since Paul, because the idea that Christians are persecuted for their beliefs, has a central figure in Jesus being executed on the cross, right? And so Catholics from early times, Catholics, both Eastern Catholic and Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic, had martyrdom and Christian martyrdom as an organizing, kind of an emotional organizing principle. It was absolutely crucial, absolutely important. Fox's Book of Martyrs was first published in the early 16th century, and it was republished with more martyrs and different kinds of martyrs every decade, practically, in the hundreds of years since. So that's big in Christianity of all types, and it has a lot of emotional resonance. So missionaries often, carried their own coffins to their outposts and did so with a certain pride, because if you died in that service, that was not only respected, but also really touching on the heart of a kind of emotional heart of Christianity. Evangelicals were not that into it in the early days of evangelical rise, especially in the 20th century, because they saw this kind of focus on martyrdom as a kind of Catholic affectation. It's Catholics that have Jesus on the cross, and it's the Protestants who have the cross with no Jesus because it's, yucky. And the idea that Catholics are the ones who worry about saints and martyrs, we don't, Protestants say we don't do that. But then as they became more global and as they became kind of more organized in the 1950s and 60s, a discourse about Christian persecution and missionary suffering was always a little bit there, but became more and more important. And soon they began talking not just about missionaries as persecuted, but the new believers who were rising up in especially places like Africa and Latin America, where there were a lot of conversions. Those folks are sometimes in situations, and in the Middle East where there are fewer conversions, where they're facing real opposition or real persecution. Other times, as this became in Eastern Europe and in other communist countries where Christians were in fact sometimes outlawed, sometimes persecuted, this begins to take on more and more resonance in the 50s and 60s and 70s. The persecution of Christians under communism has great emotional power in the United States. And then with the end of the Cold War and the increasing focus on Christians in the Third World, who are becoming, a majority of the world's Christians by now, I believe, or very close to, that the sense that there were people in all sorts of situations where they weren't the majority, where they were facing an unhelpful government or a hostile government, where Christians were being persecuted, takes on a kind of organizing life for Americans. I mean, it makes no sense to think about the so-called war on Christmas if you hadn't been thinking about the so-called war on Christians for 2 decades. And that war on Christians had always been articulated as a war on Christians in communist Vietnam and Cuba, in the Soviet Union, and then later in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or in other places where there was tension with Muslims, or in Afghanistan, of course. And so that notion of a kind of war on Christians against unbelievers, against believers who were in minority in another country, in a country where they were not the majority or not in the ruling leadership, that's taken up by Americans as part of their kind of globalizing interest. So I sort of show in my book how this takes off with missionary work in the 50s and 60s, and then becomes a huge deal with the end of the Cold War, and then with the rise of the internet, where people are paying attention to persecuted Christians everywhere. As this becomes part of evangelical identity, it's more articulate, more vivid for people who have a real global interest. So I went to South Sudan with a megachurch outside of Wisconsin as part of their missionary trip, and they were very moved by the idea of these southern Sudanese Christians as persecuted by Sudan, by the leadership in Sudan, or what is now Sudan. And they had connections with them that had been built up over many years for that reason. But when you see that, or when you talk about that at church and you bring it back to Wisconsin, or you bring it back to South Carolina or wherever, people start seeing Christians as persecuted, not just historically, but now. And then, these are our brothers and sisters of Christ and around the world. Then it becomes kind of borrowed as a way of understanding yourself. And I say borrowed because I actually do believe that there are Christians in these other countries who are actually suffering, who actually are not allowed to build churches in Sudan when it was still one country, all sorts of things. But that sense that, okay, we know we don't suffer as much as they do, but we evangelicals are persecuted too because, look, people don't respect us. People criticize the founder of Chick-fil-A when he says he doesn't believe in gay marriage, and they start boycotting him. See, they hate Christians. And I literally had a friend from high school say to me, if anybody else had said that, nobody would have done anything. But because he's a Christian, they boycotted him. And so that sense of we are persecuted then really energizes this ridiculous, people are saying happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas. And it's proof that that we no longer, we are persecuted and the world is falling apart. So it's a very powerful, I don't want to understate it. It's a very powerful, emotionally riveting position, victimhood. And that's true for a lot of different people. Victimhood is a powerful, emotionally riveting position for most of us at some time or another. And definitely for evangelical Christians, being able to see oneself as they are growing more and more powerful in many ways, they are also less powerful in other ways. There's just no question, right, that the world allows gay marriage and transgender people exist and are out in the public. And, Muslims are allowed to build mosques sometimes in places. And these all mean a less dominant position for especially white evangelicals that leads people to see themselves as kind of deeply connected to this idea of being persecuted. And let me just add that this is also very deeply connected, at least since the end of the Cold War, to the anti-Muslim sentiment that is so baked in to a lot of American evangelicalism today. It is a legitimizing, deeply felt, deeply energized sense that they are in a global competition with Muslims, and that competition is both political and religious, for Americans at least, but maybe people in other places too. And that the fight, so-called, against Islam is one of the organizing political beliefs among a lot of evangelicals today.
A few years ago, you'd written an article entitled "Islamophobia is not racism." Could you perhaps explain the argument and why Islamophobia is not racism?
I think I had Islamophobia is not, and then only racism in parentheses, but maybe I didn't. I know I did say that in the piece. There's been a movement, and I think it's been really useful in the United States to talk about the ways in which Islamophobia functions like racism in the United States. I think that is correct. In the United States, where race is the most powerful organizing tool of inequality that exists, when people treat other people badly, they often tend to find ways to do so in the language and in the rhetoric and in the style of race. And so, as Muslims have been increasingly vilified in the United States since 9/11, the ways that people are vilified often have to do with things that are written on or seen as being written on the body, which is how race works too, right? So Muslim women who have their hair covered were attacked after 9/11 and are still face all sorts of discrimination, young women in schools. The idea that the Nation of Islam, for example, was a particularly kind of, quote, dangerous form of Islam, according to the FBI for a long period of time, totally connected to it being associated with Black radicalism. And even now, when we see all sorts of assumptions that people who are Muslim are, necessarily immigrants, for example, or likely to be immigrants. And now Black Muslims, Black African-American Muslims are kind of ignored as if they don't exist, and Muslims are treated as all immigrant communities. All of that shows ways in which anti-Islamic sentiment is racialized in the United States. It's not to say that you couldn't have anti-Islamic sentiment against people who seemed European, like maybe your Palestinian friend, but would still be kind of manifest in the language or the rhetorics or the style of race. So I get that completely. What I was trying to say in that piece is that Islamophobia has its own push, its own weight, even when it is not racialized. It is deadly, even when it is not racialized. So in Nigeria, as the example I was using, because I thought I was going to write a book about Nigeria, which I'm not doing, but there is incredible tension between Muslims and Christians and incredible Islamophobia at the day-to-day level among Nigerian Christians. And Nigerian Christians, many of whom are more likely to be some ethnic groups than others, and the same is true for Muslims, but the dominant group, Yoruba, is about half Christian, half Muslim. And the hostility between Muslims and Christians is not less due to that fact. It's not always hostility, but when, a Christian preacher came to preach in the North a few 10 to 15 years ago, there was a violent reaction against his being there to preach. When Muslims are political figures, that can be quite upsetting and talked about in very negative ways by Christians. So the fact is that there, I would say also in Egypt, I would say also in Sudan, it's there's a great deal of hostility in situations where anything like what we would call race is not at play. So in Sudan, I remember when I was there, I was asking, this was a sort of totally weird trip because I was there with this church from outside of Milwaukee. There were 5 of us, all adults, and all middle-aged adults. And the guy who was our contact, who later became president of the South Sudan Council of Churches, his name was Ramadan. Because his grandmother was mad at his parents and she got to name him, she punished his parents for becoming Christian by naming him Ramadan. But I asked him, because this was right when the Civil War was still like just kind of over and they were beginning to move towards peace prosperity. There was still a lot of tension, and South Sudan at that point was still part of Sudan. And I asked him, what did he feel about, the Sudan government, and like what were the issues? And he was quite clear that, the issues of being marginalized as Christians, or them wanting it to be a Muslim government and stopping churches from being built, and just generally having anti-Christian sentiment, were hugely important for people who were trying to make South Sudan a country, even though there were many other reasons for making South Sudan a country, and he would totally acknowledge that, including Arabization. They didn't want to have to speak Arabic, all sorts of other things. So in that situation, Americans used to try, this is really true, during the civil war in Sudan, Americans used to come and talk about how the Arabs of northern Sudan were attacking the Africans of South Sudan. And they were trying to racialize a conflict that was not racialized. It was, there were ethnic groups that were in play, but there was no way any American who thought that they could tell a Southern Sudanese from a Northern Sudanese was just kidding themselves. It was really about something else. But that was the language, because that's how Americans make sense of things.
So I recognize the gist of the argument is basically that, sure, Islamophobia often takes on notions of race, and it's often just straight up racist, but there's like an added thing. So for example, I think the Nigerian example is pretty clear, where you're saying in that context, we're talking about one Nigerian, another Nigerian, but let's say American evangelical will side with one over the other, even though they're, both in the same place, because one is a Christian, one is a Muslim. So there's something like an added thing there. So my counter to that would be, but isn't that often racialized? Because, for example, a woman who is, let's say, a white woman in Europe, in Germany, whatever, she puts on a hijab and automatically she is seen as another race. That often, frequently happens. And I think the function of Islamophobia is that it, even when race, as such, is not involved, and somebody might acknowledge that, the process of racialization kind of, that's the kind of the added factor. Like that's the thing, that's the process that happens. So in a sense, those who would say Islamophobia is a form of racism, that is kind of anti-Muslim discrimination, are simply, they're not necessarily making the argument that Islam is a race, or that it's rather that this process of racialization is kind of it's discrimination simply.
Yes, but you're still taking it. I'm not saying that a European or an American would look at those two Nigerians differently. I'm saying that a Yoruba Christian and a Yoruba Muslim the Christian might actually hate the Muslim, might think Islam is a dangerous religion, might well think that Muslims are, likely to be terrorists, might have a lot of feelings about that person as a Muslim. But there is no racialization of that person as a Muslim on the part of the Nigerian Christian. There is no sense that becomes a racialized logic. I don't think so. I've never seen it or never seen an example of that. I might be wrong about it, but I think that what I'm trying to say is not that white people can't be racialized as non-white, or that race doesn't play a huge factor, including for whoever is a convert of whatever type, right, that you're racialized as a Muslim in the United States and often probably in Europe too, but that people are capable of hating Muslims and treating them like shit, even when they don't see them and are not going to see them as another race. And if you keep just a U.S. and a European perspective on it, you will not recognize what I'm arguing is the extraordinary power of anti-Muslim sentiment, even in situations where race is not there to bump it up, so to speak.
I think the counterexample I would bring is probably, for example, in this Indian subcontinent. In that context, once again, where we're talking about people who are both Indian, but one is a Muslim, one is a Hindu, the way that is often articulated is, once again, very racialized, where, again, the typical kind of meme in this regard is, the Hindu nationalist who will, draw a caricature and he'll paint the Hindu as kind of very light-skinned and the Muslim much darker skinned, and, so it's something along those lines. And once again, it's, of course, again, the typical thing would be to paint the Muslim, even though they're also Indian, as not Indian, as actually an Arab invader or something, right?
Right. I mean, I guess I'm not. I think my point was it's not one I would follow in this sort over again and again. really understand why people want to say, like, often there are so many examples of when people want to go after Muslims, they racialize them as something else. I get that. And when, of course, right, when you want to, when Southern Sudanese want to talk about Northern Sudanese as violent and aggressive, sometimes they will play on some notion of Arab or Muslim invaders or conquest. If people can put those things together, they often do. I guess I feel like there's a way in which in the United States that talking about how Muslims are racialized is not wrong. It's absolutely right. But that it almost can, because we all think of race as the thing, we don't live in places where, like Northern Ireland, where people kill and die over religious differences for hundreds of years without marking it as a racial marker. And I think that's that power of religion to create murderousness is just what I was trying to highlight.
I think there's also another example we can think about here, coming back to Gaza. I mean, a lot of figures on the right in America include Christian Palestinians vaguely under the umbrella of Muslim-adjacent people. You know, they're Christians, they're persecuted, we have to protect their churches, but they're still part of something you might think of as being Islamic civilization. So you'll hear this discourse from figures like Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, many others, that, look, we're very concerned about what's happening to these Christians, but also we're equally concerned with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, because where are these people going to go if they're ethnically cleansed? They're going to come here, and they're not compatible with life in America or life in Europe or life in the West. And they're saying that about Christian Palestinians as much as they are Muslim Palestinians. So yeah, I just thought I'd just introduce that by way of example.
Yeah. By the way, Christian Palestinians have been trying to draw on this persecuted Christians discourse to sort of organize Americans to be more pro-Palestinian for some time, in, I think, pretty problematic ways, but it has been also somewhat successful. So for years, for about a decade, every 2 years at Bethlehem Bible College, an evangelical institution, they held a conference called Christ at the Checkpoint, which brought Christians from around the world to try to talk about the ways that Palestinian Christians are persecuted Christians, not just by kind of the normal language, but persecuted by the Israeli occupation, trying to get them to understand that they are suffering in the occupation and that you should pay attention to them because they're Christian. The problem with that is they're trying to get themselves into the sort of orbit of moral concern through their Christianity rather than through their humanity, which I am generally not in favor of. But it was quite effective in having some Americans who had not thought about Palestine begin to think about it.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question here, maybe two, depending on whether Mohammed has something else to ask. I wanted to ask you where you think the U.S. Israel relationship is headed. Israel, we said earlier, seems to be losing support on both the right and the left. It now seems to be a prerequisite for candidates running for office to say, I'm not going to take a dime from AIPAC in order to succeed. And it's made figures like Zohran Mamdani, Graham Plattner, and others on the left very successful and popular. But arguably also, it's working. It's working equally for figures on the right like Thomas Massey, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and even someone like James Fishback, who I guess is some groyper running for Florida governor. Yeah. So where do you think that relationship is headed?
Yeah, I wish I felt like I knew. I feel, as you sort of suggested, that there's such different indications happening in a number of different directions. Like on the one hand, yes, there is the real move, both on the right and the left, but certainly on the left, that being critical of Israel, being supportive of Palestinians, is more than legitimate, that it is a moral position that people want to see and are committed to seeing. And yet more than ever, we see how punished that speech is in any situation where it can be punished. That is to say, it is, and I can say this speaking from being in a university setting, people are afraid when they go to teach in ways that I've never seen. The students have been punished and have not, I would have expected students to be out just around the ICE stuff, the terrible, terrible stuff that's been happening. And I think they've been really silenced in a number of ways, and for good reason. They feel fearful. So I feel like we are in a situation that is the most anti-Palestinian, the most shut down around Palestinian speech, the most violently oppressive of pro-Palestinian thoughts, activism, or speech I've ever seen in my life, and the most movement among people for actually, when I was coming up, you didn't even say the word Palestine, for saying Palestine, for seeing Palestinians as human beings, for actually thinking that this is, that what is happening there is a travesty. My worry is that all sorts of people who had no time for a two-state solution back in the day when that was a realistic possibility, had no time for a Palestinian state and never showed any interest in it, are now becoming all willing to talk about it, and especially around two states, precisely because that is no longer a possibility. And they may not recognize that, but it reminds me of how, people began talking romantically and nostalgically about Native Americans at a point when Native Americans had been, so obliterated as a population in the United States. And so my feeling is that, and I wish I didn't think this, is that Israel is going to manage to refuse a Palestinian state for a very long time, and that Americans are going to, if they manage what I think they're going to manage, which is to try to get a lot of parts of Gaza to leave. And then I think that Americans will have the ability and in general, to stop paying attention again. So I feel like, I hope I'm wrong. I hope I am wrong, dead center and forever, that Israel is going to keep on doing what it's doing and manage to get it off the front page of the news and continue the slow, eating alive of Palestine by village, house by house, in the West Bank, and taking over Gaza through the whatever restoration or rebuilding happens there. So I feel pretty hopeless about it, honestly. But if a two-state solution managed to be developed and were successfully pursued and Palestinians were on board with it, I would be delighted. It's not that I'm opposed to it, because I don't care what solution gets us there to Palestinians having sovereignty and rights. I don't see it. I can't imagine, given what the landscape looks like and the control over the landscape that the Israelis have managed over the last 30 years, could ever lead to anything. I could not imagine how Palestinians could look around and see what the Israelis control and say, yeah, we'll take part of what's left. So, that was already a hell of a lot to ask in 1951. It's a lot different now. What I do think is that the Israelis, and they well know this, right? They have only one option if they continue. Well, they have only one option as far as I can tell right now, which is they are going to run an apartheid state until they stop running an apartheid state. And they understand, but it's not stopping anybody, that Palestinians in this moment right now would be a slim majority if in a single state. Just as it happened in South Africa when nobody thought it could happen, I feel like there is some possibility and some good reason to have a single state. I was saying 40 years ago to one of my best friends, like, if the Israelis don't do something, it's going to be one state. And for 80 years or 50 years, it might be Israel. And after that, it's going to be Palestine. And so my biggest hope is that actually that the people on the ground there, I'm trying to find hope. I'm not good at it, but I try to. And there's an organization I'm sure you all know about, 972 Magazine, which is run by Palestinians and Israelis who live inside the Green Line. And one of the things I love about that, in addition to how hard-hitting that journal is the fact that it's named after the telephone extension that everybody shares, right? 972 is the telephone area code. And so that fact of like, this is the area code, this is us, we are here. If we can find a way to create a community of people that enlarges over and over time that can make a state that is democratic and free, then that's the only way I can see this playing out. Because I just can't see either side agreeing, but certainly, the Israelis are making sure that there's not much for Palestinians to agree to. So I think that, there have been Palestinians who've been calling for one state for a long time. I really don't see it as my role since I'm not Palestinian, as weighing in hard, like this should be what you all should support, like whatever people decide is their way forward, is what's going to happen. But that's the only thing I can see.
Bringing it back to kind of the discussion of the far right in the US, particularly that segment of the far right, which is kind of, anti-Zionist via the means of anti-Semitism, there's an interesting kind of grouping that's kind of taking place. So we see figures like, let's say, a video emerged the other day of Nick Fuentes, it seems, going to a club listening to Kanye West alongside a figure like Myron Gaines, who is, a Sudanese guy called Amro Fadl, Sneeko, who is a Muslim convert. It's a very kind of strange amalgamation of, people. Is this just like an ephemeral kind of internet phenomenon? People seem to have like very big followings online, but is it just an online thing that's going to disappear in a few years or evaporate, or is there something more to this?
You mean the anti-Zionism via anti-Semitism?
Yeah, and again, specifically like these internet celebrities, like streamers and people who, again, have millions and millions following them online, and memes done about them, and probably, subreddits devoted to them. But beyond the internet, is there, number one, like, can we just dismiss something that just because it's like it exists on the internet? Or is there something that we should take seriously about this? Does it have any existence outside of the internet? Does it matter?
Well, a number of different things I can say. Yes, the internet matters. Who's there? Who's talking to each other? Who's making memes together? Whatever. The kind of conversations that you see that people can even put Nick Fuentes and Kanye West, which I just love that idea of like having them together in a club, right? That's what she said. But what I would say is what we've seen, and we've seen this in Europe too, is that internet-based communities many times do find their way out into the world. They find their way out into the world when somebody picks up and goes and kills a bunch of people because they saw something online that made them think that was a good idea. When somebody, comes to DC and tries to assassinate people at a pizza restaurant because he thinks they're abusing children in the basement. So it happens that way. But it also happens in the sense that I think that anti-Zionism via anti-Semitism will sort of move out into adjacent communities as more respectable, as it is repeated more and more often in places that, I'm not spending my time. You may only be spending your time because you have to, but then when that gets said enough times and said often enough, then somebody else says a kind of quieter version of that. And then that quieter version gets, acceptable in a slightly different space. And I can give you an example. It's way kind of off point, but it's just one I was reading about and thinking about today. And it is connected to Christian Zionism. So Christian nationalists often in the United States often talk about the seven mountain, it's based on a book, and Seven Mountain Mandate. Okay. So I was thinking about this way that ideas slide from one place to another and become more and more acceptable through another issue, which is Christian Zionism. And Christian nationalists in the United States, who are almost always also Christian Zionists, but they also have many more views than Christian Zionism per se. And they believe that America should be run by Christians. And if Christians are going to do that, they have to take on the Seven Mountain Mandate, which is to say the Christian control of American life through seven different parts of the country. And so the Seven Mountain Mandate means that Christians need to dominate family, religion, media, education, business, government, and culture. Culture meaning like the feelings in general. And so these 7 are, a big part, a big signifier of whether you believe that the U.S. should be a Christian country and run by Christians, this 7 mountain mandate. Now, Charlie Kirk, who was a Christian nationalist, but who was also trying very hard to reach people who weren't Christian nationalists, never said that phrase. He never said 7 mountain mandate. But he did say that he believed that President Trump understood that importance of the 7 different cultures that people needed to control, that Christians needed to be influential in. And so anybody who knew anything knew what he was talking about. And it brought it into, though, now we're going to talk about the 7 different cultures, not the 7 mountain mandate, which connects back to a very specific theological guy in his book and, this other thing. And so that term, which sounds very esoteric and weird, becomes more normalized. And then somebody like Charlie Kirk sort of brings it into, his part of the Christian mainstream right and to a new generation, right? The turning point generation. I think the same thing happens online, especially because of younger people being so much more online. But I think the same thing happens frequently. We've seen it with all sorts of things in evangelical culture. For example, the whole trad wife thing, where young women are all interested in being a traditional wife and, not having to, and that, Charlie Kirk was a big believer in that too. But that went from being some weirdo part of the Christian internet to being something that is sold through just like Farmer John and his pretty wife in a dress, and nobody's talking about it. It's a Christian thing per se, and nobody's necessarily even saying the term trad wife, but wouldn't it be nice to have this handsome guy and his goats be your life? And I think that is why, that stuff really, I think we're going to see a rise in young women's notion of what they want out of their lives to be much more shaped by that and never have any idea where it's coming from. So anyway, that's me a long way around saying, I don't know who all is looking at these kind of things online now, but what I'm pretty sure, given how things work and given the broad reach of the kind of people you're talking about, is they will get picked up, sanitized a bit, and translated out to all sorts of other people. And so I think we have to take this stuff extremely seriously.
That was great. We're out of time, but thank you very much, Melanie. It was a really great conversation.
It was really fun to talk to you both. Thank you.
And to our listeners, we do hope you enjoyed this episode, and we welcome your comments, feedback, and suggestions. Send us an email at proteanview@muftah.org. Whether you're hearing this on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, we'd really appreciate a 5-star review or a like. This helps improve the visibility of the show, and with your support, we can keep Protean View running and gradually improve it. Visit us at muftah.org and navigate to the Protean View tab to see all our episodes, and follow us on our socials using the handle @ProteanView, including on Patreon, where you can become a paid patron and receive exclusive content. Until next time.